Welcome. Good evening. I'm Chris Parslovsky, Senior Program Director with the Hudson River Valley Institute, and we are glad to have you with us for the program this evening. If you encounter any audio issues, you have the option to dial in by telephone, and that code has been provided in the webinar chat. You should see it now. Due to the number of participants, we have muted all lines except for the host and panelists. And we will be reserving the chat function for any technical issues you might have questions for myself or other staff. Please do not send private messages to the presenter as he will probably not see them. And please do use the Q&A feature to send us any questions you want us to ask at the end of the presentation. A full recording of the presentation will be available in the next few days and will be posted on the Hudson River Valley Institute YouTube channel. You'll receive an email once that is online. And now to introduce tonight's speaker, we have the Hudson River Valley Institute Director, Thomas Wormuth.
Well, thank you, Chris, and good evening, everyone. I am Tom Wormuth, Director of the Hudson River Valley Institute, and I want to welcome everyone tonight on this, the longest day of the year. We have viewers from within the Hudson Valley and from beyond, so a special welcome to everyone. Now, right up front, I want to thank the Marist Alumni Office and the Marist Information Technology Area for supporting this event. This program is part of the Hudson River Valley Institute's American Revolution 250 series, which will continue through 2026 and beyond, 250th, the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. There are several members of the Hudson River Valley Institute Advisory Board here tonight, and I'd like to acknowledge them. Eileen Cook and Denise Van Buren, Colonel Jim Johnson, the Emeritus Frank T. Bumpus Chair in Hudson River Valley History, also friend of the Institute, Tom McHenry, and Marist Trustee Stephen Efron. I would also like to recognize the Hudson River Valley Institute Executive Director, Andy Villani, who along with Senior Program Director Chris Parslovsky has put together the program this evening. Now, the Hudson River Valley Institute at Marist College is the academic arm of the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area. Its mission is to study and promote the study of the Hudson River Valley, its history, its culture, its art, its literature, all the things which are central to the Valley's rich history and heritage. We do this through a variety of different mechanisms. We have lectures like tonight, lecture series. We work with teachers in elementary and high schools and working on teaching the Hudson Valley educational curriculum. We have our digital library, which has several 100,000 pages of historical documents digitized. We also have, of course, our journal, the Hudson River Valley Review. And the spring 2023 issue of the Hudson River Valley Review is now out, and I encourage everyone to subscribe if you don't already. Tonight's featured speaker is Dr. Mark Edward Lender, and his lecture is titled Strategic Success, Operation Prowess and Tactical Daring, Fort Ticonderoga, John Brown's Raid, and the Matter of Compound Warfare. Dr. Lender is Professor Emeritus of History at Kean University. He's the author or co-author of 12 books and many articles on early American military, social, and institutional history, including Cabal, the Plot Against George Washington, Fatal Sunday, George Washington, the Monmouth Campaign, and my personal favorite, which I use every time I teach the American Revolution, is co-authored book, A Respectable Army, The Military Origins of the Republic, with James Kirby Martin. Dr. Lender's most recent book, Fort Ticonderoga, The Last Campaigns, The War in the North, highlights the strategic importance of the fort as British, American, and regional forces fought for control of the Northern Front. It captures the complexity of the story as it unfolded, corrects misconceptions, develops sense, and brings new insights into the struggle for independence. And now I want to welcome Dr. Mark Lender.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank everyone at Marist for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and I certainly appreciate all the folks who have tuned in. As Dr. Weymouth just explained, I'm going to be talking about a particular raid in September of 1777 that had, I'm arguing, very, very broad significance that showed how the Patriot War effort unfolded from the strategic level to the operational level and right on down to the tactical level, particularly in the Northern Theater, where this kind of interaction between regular American forces and militia forces hasn't been as greatly appreciated as I think it has been in other theaters. Let's look at this. For those of you who have been to Fort Ticonderoga, you may have noticed a plaque as you walk into the fort. There is a rather small plaque, and it commemorates a raid by a Colonel John Brown on between September 17th and the 22nd of 1777. It was a brief, sharp engagement, and we'll go into that. But I think beyond the intrinsic interest in what happened, we've largely overlooked the implications of why it was important, why it's worth our knowing about, and we're going to talk about that importance this evening. Compound warfare is going to be the touchstone of what I'm going to discuss. We look at the definition from the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. It is the phenomenon of regular and irregular forces fighting in concert. The goal is to get the synergistic effects of conventional and irregular operations. Look, that's a lot of technical stuff for the actually coordination of regular troops, in this case, the Continental Army, with necessarily irregulars, because the American militia was not an irregular force. It was actually fairly well organized, particularly in the North, the area we're talking about. But it's not the haphazard, almost coincidental engagement of militia cooperating with Continentals, but the meshing, the careful meshing of their operations, taking advantage of the flexibility of the militia, the discipline and experience of the regulars. And I'm going to argue that this has been overlooked, or overlooked to an extent that it has not been overlooked in the South, because the master of all this, the man who could put together continental and militia cooperation par excellence, was Nathaniel Greene, Rhode Islander, a very close subordinate of George Washington. It was Washington who sent Greene south to retrieve the situation after two American armies, one surrendered at Charleston, one was shattered, and it was just a dismal situation. And Greene had to go south, and as most of you know, put together a brilliant campaign in which, using minimal forces, but closely coordinated between his regulars, and it was a small group of regulars, and larger groups of militia, in essence, exhausted the British military effort in the South. It was an example of how to win a war. He never won a battle, but he certainly won a campaign. What about the North? Did something similar happen in the North, and does compound warfare explain what happened in the Northern Theater? This is some background, and I'm sure this is mostly familiar to you. We're talking about the invasion in 1777 out of Quebec of a British army led by Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. Here's the well-known famous portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds of Burgoyne. And I'm sure the outline of his campaign is familiar to you as well. It was devised pretty much in London by Lord George Germain, the American secretary and the British minister most responsible for the war effort in British North America. And it had an invasion by Burgoyne coming out of Quebec, driving south down the Champlain, Lake George corridor, or the Hudson River corridor, goal being Albany, New York. The second leg, led by, or supposedly led by, Lieutenant General William Howe, was going to drive north up the Hudson River Valley, meet Burgoyne at Albany, and sever New England from the states to the south. The thinking was that New England, being the more truculent of the colonies, they were cut off from the south. They could throttle the rebellion piecemeal, if nothing else, by controlling the Hudson Valley, Champlain Valley complex. It was the best north-south communications route. You could cut off the supplies particularly food supplies and forage from the New England states reaching down into the southern states. To add a third dimension, and you can see it in green, this was an add-on by Germain to allow another force. This would have been under Colonel, well, I was made a temporary brigadier general for this, Barry St. Ledger, who would come down through Ontario, and he would come up Mohawk River to meet Howe and Burgoyne in Albany. On paper, it was a really nice plan, and it seemed to be working. As far as Burgoyne knew, his campaign was doing what it was supposed to do. What Burgoyne did not know until August, and by that time it was too late, that Howe was not coming north. Howe was driving on Philadelphia, where he hoped to engage Washington in a showdown fight. Burgoyne was on his own, particularly on his own when it became clear that St. Ledger was not able to force his way up the Mohawk. The details of that campaign are beyond our ken tonight. We just need to know that Burgoyne was coming south. On the 6th of July, he forced the Americans to evacuate Fort Ticonderoga. And let's just go back to this for 1 second. Ticonderoga, you will see right here. Saratoga, Albany, this is the course that Burgoyne was taking. Now, Burgoyne started with about 7,000 men. He lost some at Bennington earlier in his campaign, but he left a garrison at Ticonderoga. Originally, he had left the 62nd Foot. He brought it south to join him in his drive on Albany. He returned from his main army, the 53rd Foot. He sent the 53rd back to Ticonderoga because some of those troops were sick, and the last thing a general needed was for fever to spread throughout his army when it was on campaign. He sent the 53rd back to convalesce and to get it away from the rest of his troops. He sent with them a company of Royal Artillery, a couple of guns, and the German Prince Frederick Regiment. These were not Hessians, they're touchy about that. These were Brunswickers. And altogether, they were under the command of Brigadier General Henry Wilson Powell. He had about 900 men. This is the best portrait we have got of General Henry Wilson Powell. It's unusual because at the end of his career, well after the American Revolution, Powell was a full general. And he's one of the only full generals from the 18th century that I can think of, for which no formal portrait exists. That's the best we've got. And it's just a place filler, really. If a portrait was done, it has not survived, or if it has survived, it has not come to light. The Don Triani picture of the 53rd soldier is a very, very accurate rendition of the 53rd's regimental uniform. And you have a contemporary print of the Prince Frederick Regiment. These were good troops, but there weren't all that many of them. This is what General Powell had to cover. This is the fort itself in the center of your slide. Over here, you have what was the British called Sugarloaf Mountain, what the Americans called Mount Defiance. The guns on Mount Defiance were the guns really that helped the British drive the Americans from the fort in the first week of July. And over here was Mount Independence, which the Americans had fortified, and of course the British now occupied. So you have three main concentrations of British troops: the old fort itself, Mount Defiance, and the bulk of the troops over on Mount Independence, which was the most defensible of these positions. 900 men was not a lot. Powell was hard-pressed to garrison the area that was charged to him, but it was important because Ticonderoga, even as Burgoyne moved south, was the focus of supply operations for Burgoyne. Supplies were moved by bateau, large scow-like boats, down Lake George, overland, and down the Hudson River. It was an operation that was ongoing all the time as Burgoyne moved south. Reinforcements that began to filter down from Canada, intending to reach Burgoyne, had to come through Fort Ticonderoga. So Ticonderoga and its outlying positions had to be garrisoned and had to be held if Burgoyne's rear areas were to be protected. Howe, frankly, was derelict in his security operations, even with 900 men spread out over a large area. All the contemporary evidence we have got indicates, I'm not blaming the sentries themselves, but all the contemporary evidence we have got indicate that security operations simply weren't taken seriously by Powell and his senior officers. The reports we have in private letters and after the fact accounts of what happened at Fort Ticonderoga indicate that if the sentries were on duty, they didn't go very far beyond their immediate areas. They did not patrol heavily into the countryside. There were rumors that Americans had become aware that security operations at Fort Ticonderoga were rather lax, but no one seemed to put any stock in further rumors. The Americans actually might strike Fort Ticonderoga and try to disrupt Burgoyne's supply and reinforcement operations and cut off his communications. The strategic picture. Where did the origins of the operation against Ticonderoga begin? It began with the commander-in-chief. Washington in 1777 was focused as an operational and even a tactical commander on the drive of Lord William Howe, on Philadelphia. Washington would be fighting his campaign around Philly. As you know, he had a very rough time of it. Battle after battle went against him. Nevertheless, as commander-in-chief, he had to take a very, very large picture. And his thinking about what the British would be doing in 1777 was very, very similar to what Lord George Germain was thinking in London. His focus was on the Hudson River, Lake Champlain Valley system, for all the reasons we discussed. Washington was very, very concerned that if the British cut the Champlain-Hudson Valley line, that New England would indeed be isolated. And it made perfect sense to Washington that that's what the British must be up to. But he really didn't know. As it became clear that British forces were marshaling in Canada, in Quebec actually, he had a number of things on his mind. We have correspondence from the period from Washington himself, but also his subordinate officers, members of Congress, private letters, indicating that there was all kinds of speculation that the British advance from Canada, really, it wasn't going to come as a major operation. Aim it all, it would be a feint to draw Americans away from other targets. He thought, Washington, perhaps as a small force came south, the major British force would go out the St. Lawrence River, go down through New York, and target the Hudson River moving north. Maybe even they'd keep going south and hit Charleston, South Carolina. They really didn't know. When it became clear that Burgoyne was coming south in force, that it was not a feint, that he was really coming, driving on Albany, Washington's reaction was a classic response in terms of compound warfare. There were very few Continental soldiers in the North to begin with. But what he did was react in such a way as to mobilize Continental forces and match them immediately with militia troops. This was a coordinated response. It was compound warfare. Here's the first order he gave in this regard. This is less than 2.5 weeks after the British had taken Fort Ticonderoga and sent the American army packing in the north. He wrote to Major General Benjamin Lincoln. This was a Massachusetts officer, had broad experience in militia operations, but then he had a Continental Commission. Now you've got a Continental Major General with good connections to the militia. This is the man that Washington turns to and says, go north, meet General Schuyler, organize the Eastern Militia, and do what you can to stop Burgoyne. Now, Schuyler is replaced by Major General Horatio Gates. Many of you know the story of how Gates and Schuyler politically intrigued against one another. For the time being, at least, Gates won that. He replaced Schuyler. But Lincoln went north. And he sits down with Horatio Gates. On the 24th of August in 1777, Washington's letters had gone to Gates, repeating what he had told Benjamin Lincoln. Sit down with Lincoln, come up with a plan to get behind Burgoyne's line of advance toward Albany. See what you can do to disrupt his communications. See what you can do to disrupt his lines of supply and possible reinforcement. Gates, Lincoln sat down on the 24th of August. Gates essentially gave Benjamin Lincoln a free hand, and here's the plan that Lincoln came up with. It was called the Paulette Expedition because Lincoln based his operations out of the town of Paulette, and here you go, down here. He came up with a plan with about 2,000 mixed Continentals, but mostly militia. He would keep approximately 500 men with him, and he would send 3 columns out on a raid. First would be led by Colonel John Brown, and we'll talk about John Brown in a minute. But Brown would go up Lake George and hit at Ticonderoga itself. Colonel Johnson, whose track we really won't monitor all that closely, we'll mention him later, would go to confront Mount Independence across Lake Champlain from Colonel Brown's target. He would be going after Mount Defiance and the old fort itself. The hope was that Johnson would prevent the British from sending people across to reinforce the old fort and Mount Defiance. Then a 3rd column would go down to Fort Anne. It was just a post near the bottom of Lake George, Lake Champlain rather, just as a reserve. It was a fairly complicated plan, but the main thrust, and the one we're going to follow, was 500 men under Colonel John Brown. Who were these raiders? Well, we go back to compound warfare. You had experienced officers with Continental backgrounds or a long militia service. You had approximately 500 Continental regular troops who were interspersed with militia in all 3 of the columns. So a majority of these troops were militia. But you had an elite Continental Ranger outfit under Captain Ebenezer Allen with the assault column. That is John Brown's command. Ebenezer Allen was a cousin of the famous Ethan Allen of Fort Ticonderoga. You had a personnel mixture, which was a classic of compound warfare. Benjamin Lincoln carefully combined his regulars and his militia resources, and this even went into the logistics planning for the whole thing. For example, you had a militia brigadier general in Vermont who also happened to have a Continental Commission as the chief commissary officer of the Northern Army. So you had militia and regulars operating in supply, quartermaster, commissary operations as well, gathering up wagons, gathering up supplies, gathering up ammunition to make sure that all three of these columns were properly equipped. It was a wonderful example of cooperation between how the militia, citizen soldiers, could cooperate with the Continental regulars. That's the best available portrait of Colonel John Brown. It's obviously the same artist who did the portrait of Brigadier General Powell. For such an important figure, and John Brown was quite an extraordinary individual. We don't have a portrait of him. He was an early patriot. He was on the original Ethan Allen Benedict Arnold raid of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775. He was heavily involved in the American invasion of Canada in 1775, and he ran afoul of Benedict Arnold. Of all of the critics of Benedict Arnold, Colonel John Brown was among the most virulent and the earliest. He was not alive to say, "I told you so," when Benedict Arnold turned traitor, but he was absolutely convinced early on that Arnold was up to no good. Most of his charges against Arnold, frankly, were pretty fanciful. It was a personal dislike between the two men, and it became quite serious. But he was a capable individual. He had a Continental commission as a lieutenant colonel in the Massachusetts Continental Line, which when Congress refused to believe his charges against Benedict Arnold, that Arnold was in fact stealing, he resigned in disgust and became a colonel in the Massachusetts militia. But he kept his contacts in the Continental Army. And the best evidence we've got is that Benjamin Lincoln picked him to lead the assault column, the heavy assault column, because of his experience, not just as a personal combat leader, but because he had shown the opportunity, shown the ability to work both with regular and militia forces in combination. So what was he going to do? Lieutenant John Stark, Royal Navy, after the fact, drew up an extremely detailed map of what had happened. Stark was very, very critical of British security operations that had allowed the Americans to get close and launch what became a surprise attack. So, recalling the map of the Burgoyne invasion, here is Fort Ticonderoga itself. Here is Mount Defiance. Here is a fortification on Mount Independence. Here is the campground of the 53rd Regiment. Here also are places where American prisoners of war were put to work building roads to facilitate supply shipments to Lake George, where they were then shipped down the lake, ultimately to try to reach Burgoyne. Brown was crafty enough to get his people on the slopes of Mount Defiance on the 17th of September. British security operations were lax enough so that a small British garrison on the top of Mount Defiance never knew for a full day that the Americans, the strength of 500, had reached the bottom of the mountain and were taking cover in the woods. The 53rd Regiment camped right here, never saw them. This is testimony to two things. First of all, the Americans knew what they were doing. Brown was a capable commander, got his people in position, and then spent the rest of the 17th of September gathering intelligence on British dispositions. Lieutenant Stark, as he compiled his after-action report, was absolutely convinced, and other forces corroborate him, that when Brown struck on the morning of the 18th, he knew exactly where he was going. He knew the strength of British dispositions. He knew exactly how to go. Morning of the 18th, two things happened. A group under Ebenezer Allen, the Continental Ranger, overran in a brief fight the guard on top of Mount Defiance. The rest, Brown's command, swept off the slope of Mount Defiance and overran the 53rd. There were several companies of the 53rd on the campground. They didn't stand a chance. About 250 British were taken prisoner in one fell swoop. It was a tactically beautiful operation. Also, they released at least 100, and I'm convinced it was actually probably closer to 150 American prisoners of war who had been captured when the British took Fort Ticonderoga on July the 6th. They were subsequently armed with captured British weapons, so now you have Brown with a much stronger force. They then turned north up the road to a bridge and swooped down on the old fort itself. One historian's description of that attack was that the Americans came whooping up as sort of a disorganized mob, crossed the bridge, and descended on the fort. I don't think so. Everything that I've seen indicates that Brown maintained very, very good command and control. Once he had overrun the 53rd, he reorganized and quickly headed north. And I think the fact that he was able to do it in such a fashion is testimony to how surprised the British were. If they'd been going forth as a mob, they would not have hit in any organized way, and the British would have had a chance to at least get word back to the old fort and Mount Independence. As it was, the folks in the old fort itself only found out that they were under attack when Americans actually appeared outside the outer defense of the old post. It was a tactically beautifully executed operation, and compliments to Benjamin Lincoln for his operational plan, because it worked at the tactical level. What actually happened? I think closer to 150 Patriot POWs, actually. 150 British troops were captured. More to the point, British logistics operations were completely disrupted. When Brown, he had an option to actually capture the old fort, he decided there was really no point in doing so. His job, his actual mission, was to release the American POWs and disrupt British logistical operations, and that he did. He made it impossible for the British to ship anything south, because he tore up their carts, he tore up their wagons, burned everything. He burned hundreds of bateaux that otherwise would have been used to ship supplies south to Burgoyne. If Burgoyne hadn't surrendered when he did, he could not have been resupplied or reinforced from Ticonderoga. And I do want to emphasize that reinforcements were filtering down from Quebec. They were arriving even as Brown sat outside the fort, deciding whether or not to take it, but then decided just to tear up British logistics. Then something else came in. As Burgoyne understood and his officers understood that he was running into trouble, that he was probably not going to make it to Albany, there was a suggestion that he turn around and go back to Ticonderoga. Well, that wasn't going to happen. Had he chosen to retreat from Saratoga, it's very, very likely that Brown and the rest of Lincoln's troops could have not only complicated his effort, probably even prevented it. How would the British have gone? The transport, it would have been an overland operation, because the ships were, or the shipping was destroyed. It would have been very, very difficult. He probably would have been swallowed up in the American wildernesses. Militia was swarming out of New England states and even from New York State. It would have been very, very difficult. It was a tremendous blow to British morale. When word leaked out about Brown's raid, the the British were genuinely shaken and Patriot spirits were boosted. Washington, in the midst of planning for a counterattack at Germantown, in October, he had hoped to mount a counterattack after his losses around Philadelphia. Stopped, had a review, fired artillery and musket salutes in honor of what John Brown had done. Word out to the troops that in the North, things were turning in American favor. It really was not just a boost to the morale in the Northern Army, but to the main army under Washington as well. There were subsequent failures in Brown's operation. He attacked Diamond Island, which was down Lake George, close to the end of Lake George. It didn't work. Johnson's column did not take Mount Independence, but that really wasn't expected. The Americans, it simply didn't register. What registered with the Patriot cause was the fact that Ticonderoga had been counterattacked, that the British had been disrupted, that their morale had been shaken. It demonstrated that the Northern Front was very much alive, even in the face of Burgoyne's move to the south. In Canada, when word of Brown's raid reached Canada, Governor Guy Carleton, there was genuine consternation. We have the correspondence left, and I was able to use material from the Canadian archives. Carleton wondered what on earth is going on down there. He did not like Burgoyne. The men were not friends. But Carleton had done his best to support Burgoyne's operation. But now, what's going on? The reports were dire. Carleton sent Brigadier General Alan McLean south with a small contingent of troops to find out what was going on. McLean got to Fort Ticonderoga, conferred with Powell, gathered what intelligence he could. It was quite clear to McLean that Fort Ticonderoga was vulnerable. It was just after he got there, word reached them that Burgoyne, if he had not surrendered, was in dire trouble. And while he was still there, Burgoyne did surrender. McLean assessed the situation and said, with Burgoyne captured, his army out of the picture, it would be impossible to hold Fort Ticonderoga if the Americans came north after capturing Burgoyne. He recommended pulling out immediately and using his authority as granted by Governor Carleton, he ordered Powell to head north. Fort Ticonderoga fell back into American hands without another shot being fired. Brown's raid. Let's make a few comparisons here. Everybody, well, not everybody, but most students of the Revolution and a lot of history buffs are quite aware of Anthony Wayne's raid on Stony Point in July of 1779 and Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee's raid on Paul's Hook in August of 1779. And there's been a good deal written on these, but let's look at these raids and these operations, which are very, very skillful. Anthony Wayne and Lighthorse Harry Lee attacked Stony Point and Paul's Hook with elite American regular troops. Yes, they had militia guides, but the burden of the operations fell to highly trained, highly picked. Not everybody was brought along on this. Picked troops came along on these operations, and they did exactly what had been trained to do. These operations were brilliantly carried out, very successful, Stony Point more so than Paul's Hook. Nevertheless, impressive operations. But they were operations that were undertaken more or less in isolation. They did not have an impact on ongoing operations elsewhere. Again, they did wonders for American morale. But consider what Brown did. Also wonders for American morale, but he disrupted British operations at a critical period. He made it impossible to resupply Burgoyne. As I've mentioned, Burgoyne had run into an opportunity to return to Ticonderoga. It's probably impossible. If he continued to drive south, he was not going to have more supplies. He was not going to have more reinforcements. John Brown's raid was every bit as important as the raids on Stony Point and Paulus Hook. And if Stony Point and Paulus Hook were the results of wonderful operations by regular American troops, Brown demonstrated that the careful use of compound warfare, that you could blend very carefully American regular resources with American militia resources and come up with a winning military combination. So let's look at these combinations. This is Governor Frederick Haldeman, who replaced Carleton later in the war. And he looked at the Northern Front. He understood what John Brown had done. By the way, in 1780, John Brown was killed at Stone Arabia in New York State, and Haldeman was delighted. He wrote back to Germain that this particularly insidious rebel had finally been killed. They knew who had done what to them in Fort Ticonderoga in September of 1777, and the British had it in for John Brown. The British, if you could have gone one-on-one with the Continentals in the Northern Theater, because there were so few of them. And Haldeman knew it, but Haldeman pointed out to General Henry Clinton in New York, the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, and he pointed it out to Lord George Germain back in London, the minister with the most responsibility for the American war, that the Americans could combine operations, and they were very, very good at it. It's not to say that the British didn't have tactical success on the Northern Theater. They did until quite late in the war, but they could never land a knockout blow because the Americans could always mesh what continental resources there were with effective militia cooperation. And they did that as effectively in the North as Nathaniel Greene was able to do in the South. It secured, compound warfare secured the Lake Champlain region, and it made sure that the upper Hudson Valley remained in Patriot hands through the end of the war. And we have to give credit to people like even Horatio Gates, who allowed Benjamin Lincoln to come up with his plan, his operational plan, to men like Colonel John Brown, who ran the tactical end of things, to secure that victory. It was a combination, combined warfare, a way of going about the war that the British were never able to counter. And you want to get the full story? Buy the book, there it is. And if you want a copy of the slide presentation, that's my email address. Don't hesitate to ask me for a copy. I'll get a copy to you. Thanks very much. And I appreciated the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Dr. Lender. We do have a few questions coming in already, so we'll start with those and see what else turns up.
Okay.
What had happened to Colonel Woodbridge's attack at Fort Anne? Was it successful or not?
Woodbridge didn't have to attack Fort Anne. Fort Anne, the British had abandoned as Burgoyne moved south, and Woodbridge moved in and actually began to probe south. He got as far south gradually as Fort Edward on the upper Hudson. What he wanted to do was get as far south as he could and see if he could actually, he wasn't going to confront Burgoyne directly, but he wanted to find out where Burgoyne was and what kind of strength, and frankly, to find out what was going on south of Fort Ticonderoga. So in the end, and maybe we'll wrap it up as to what happened to all three columns. In the end, Brown, Woodbridge, and Johnson, most of their troops returned to Benjamin Lincoln and ended up going south to confront Burgoyne at the battles of Saratoga. And Benjamin Lincoln played a prominent role in the Saratoga campaign.
Thank you for that. And then didn't the British also use compound warfare with loyalist troops or Native American allies? And weren't there some successful examples there as well?
Yes, they did. They did. I don't think they used it as successfully, and there were a number of reasons for that. First of all, the Indians who were involved in this fighting had their own agenda. They were not fighting necessarily out of loyalty to the crown at all. They had their own agenda. They understood that an American victory would have put enormous pressure on their homelands and their own independence. So they did not always cooperate with British authorities to the extent that the British would have liked. Also, there was the fact that while the militia, the American militia, was not in the field on major operations, they were very, very busy with local police operations. When I say police operations, they were looking for Tories. They were looking for anyone supplying information, supplies, let alone manpower to the British. And they were very, very successful in, well, let's face it, it was sort of a reign of terror. We don't like to use that word, but that's what it was. If you were a loyalist and you got on the radar screen of the local militia, you were in real trouble. So loyalist operations, while quite successful, were generally the operations of highly organized loyalist groups who based more or less out of Canada, because they were not safe in things, local conditions just weren't safe enough for them to present an opportunity for stable operations within New York State itself. There was no chance of a counter-revolution because local militia simply stamped out any signs of loyalty to the crown the minute it raised its head. And they were ruthless about it. There was no question about that. But did the British use compound warfare? Yes, they did. Yes, they did. And out west, when I say the Trans-Appalachian West, they used it very successfully. That's another story.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our alumni, Dave Marthy. Hello. Did civilians in the Hudson Valley support the actions of the militia and Continental Army? Was the North Country generally loyalist or patriot?
It was disputed. There was a large loyalist population, particularly in the Mohawk Valley, centered around the Johnson family. But, quite early in the war, most of them were driven out. There was a lot of hard feelings in the Mohawk Valley. The Mohawk Valley saw fighting, bitter fighting, even after John Brown's raid. But the local Americans were able to counter it. Usually it was Continental officers using militia troops under Continental, using Continental supplies when they were available. But again, it was the ability of the American militia to make sure that counter-revolution did not take root. That was the key to victory in the end. You had bitter fighting, don't get me wrong. It was nasty. You had the so-called burning of the valleys as the British came out of the western part of New York State, generally down from Ontario. And you had virtually a depopulation of Mohawk, Cherry Valleys areas. It was where modern Schenectady is, that really became the western frontier for a while. Quite literally, thousands of homes were burned out. We don't know how many thousands of people were forced to evacuate. Ultimately, the tide turned, but it turned only after an extremely bitter experience. It was actually an example of what we can call existential warfare, that there was no reason to hold back. You knew what the enemy was going to do to you, so if you had the opportunity, you did it to them first. It was as bitter as anything that the war saw in the southern states. I mean, the horror of what went on down south, I think, has had a lot more attention. But what happened in the Mohawk Valley and on the northern front was every bit as brutal. I mean, we like to think of the American Revolution as, should we say, not so nasty or traumatic as the French revolutions or some of the other modern revolutions, but it was thorough bloodletting.
Um, okay, this question, after the Jane McCrae murder, most loyalist activity ended. That statement, the question is now all wanted. Oh, I apologize. I'm not following this question. After the Jane McCrae murder, most loyalist activity ended and everyone wanted to get rid of Burgoyne's Native American allies. So statements.
Does this translate to what was the impact of the Jane McCrae incident?
I think so.
That pretty much does it.
Thank you.
It's debatable. Jane McCrae was. I'm from New Jersey. I'm in Richmond, Virginia now, but I'm from central New Jersey, originally in northern New Jersey. Jane McCrae was a Jersey girl. Was engaged to a loyalist officer. The circumstances of her death and the death of one of her companions is debated to this day, but it's quite clear that that an Indian did kill her, and what impact this had, it infuriated patriot opinion. There's no question about that. There is some question as to what impact it had on the ability of the militia to turn out. The militia was already coming out, and plenty of other people were killed. Civilians were killed in circumstances just as traumatic and horrifying as poor Jane McCrae. But it was that incident, the killing of a young woman, that the Americans turned into a propaganda coup. The fact that she was a loyalist, that she was engaged to a loyalist, they simply forgot about. Look, you have the British using Indian allies, who the Patriots accused of all kinds of horrific savagery, and painted it as grim as they could. This was a propaganda victory that was handed to the Americans, and they took advantage of it. Now, I really doubt that the McCrae incident that dramatically impacted the turnout of the militia to confront Burgoyne, because it was already coming out. And there's very, very little evidence that the McCrae incident really drove that militia recruiting, that militia turnout. But no doubt it hardened patriot attitudes toward the British, and certainly hardened their attitudes toward the Indians. But we have to go back to the Indians having their own agenda. They left Burgoyne, and in the end, they were not there. I mean, Burgoyne was on his own. I hope that answered the question, because or perhaps my interpretation of the question was off the mark.
No, we did get a confirmation that your interpretation was correct.
Okay.
I'm going to trust that your answer was satisfactory, if not exemplary. And time for just one last question, and then I'll return it to our director. And this is a question regarding Ethan Allen why is Ethan Allen referred to as a hero of Ticonderoga?
Why is he considered a hero of Ticonderoga?
Ticonderoga, yes.
Well, I mean, not all of us do consider him a hero, but he certainly had a reputation in 1775. He took the fort with under 50 guys. I mean, and he was feuding with Benedict Arnold over who was in charge of all the way. I mean, it was a joint command at the end. Ethan Allen had brought the troops. He had more, but he couldn't get them across Lake Champlain. And I think boat held about 40 to under 50 guys. And he got them across. Benedict Arnold provided some cover. He actually had a commission from Massachusetts. Ethan Allen was acting on his own. He was from Vermont, which was not recognized as a state. In fact, New York was hostile to Vermont because they claimed an awful lot of the real estate there. But Allen acted on his own. Benedict Arnold provided him with some cover because Benedict Arnold did, as I mentioned, did have a commission. They took the fort, and there is a great deal of speculation as to what Ethan Allen actually said. But poor Captain de la Place, he had a corporal guard. He had fewer than 50 men at the fort. Interesting, because the British understood the importance of the fort's location. And they actually had plans to revamp the fort and reinforce it as relations with the colonies began to deteriorate, but they didn't have time to act on it. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold took it and presented it to Congress. Congress didn't order that raid. Congress didn't know what to do. They said, well, we're not going to give it back, but we've got a problem on our hands. It was one of these things that helped accelerate Congress toward a war footing because locals like Ethan Allen were taking matters into their own hands. So he is the hero of Fort Ticonderoga. Had the Americans lost the war, he would not have been a hero at all. It was not his last connection with Ticonderoga, by the way. Ira Allen, his brother, Ethan Allen, were very, very frustrated with Congress for not recognizing Vermont as a state. It was New York who had claims on their real estate. Massachusetts, New Hampshire were in this mix as well, but it was mostly New York objections. And by 1781, it's pretty clear that the Allens were talking seriously with Frederick Haldeman, the governor of Quebec, whose picture you saw in one of my last slides. If not a return to the crown, but at least some sort of an arrangement with the British. There's still a debate over how serious was this. I mean, later on, Ira Allen would claim that they were negotiating with the British only to force Congress's hand to recognize them as. Others claim no. If push came to shove and Congress did not recognize them as a state, they'd reach some sort of an understanding with the British Crown. It's a debate that goes on and on. In my book, I make some comments on it.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Ira's protestations were a little fishy.
So we do have a couple other questions that have come in. Unfortunately, we don't have time for them tonight.
I'm in no rush to leave. So if you want to keep going, I'll keep going, but it's your call.
I'm still going to remind our audience, though, that this is one of a series of talks we'll be having on the semi-quincentennial, and that there will be other opportunities to ask questions and attend events, and that we do have some previous ones already on our YouTube channel. I'm going to look to my director, Tom Wormuth.
That's me. Handing it back to me.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure. Why not do the last question?
Then we'll bring you on. Okay. So again, this attack, of which you spoke, occurred a year after the Battle of Valcour Island. Do you know specific characters or militia units that served in both actions? And I think the question is what sort of overlap between the two.
I can answer that definitively. No, okay. I don't. Chris, I really don't. The Valcour Island folks were they were pretty a pickup bunch. I mean, you had it was a different kind of militia. You had an awful lot of folks who lived around the lakes, who had experience on the water. Not all of them, but as far as I know, most of those militia at Valcour Island and there are any number of works written on it, would seem to indicate that most of the folks who staffed Benedict Arnold's fleet were more or less locals who had some experience on the water. The folks who came in, who joined the Paulette expedition, Benjamin Lincoln's expedition, were militia from New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Continentals sprinkled throughout the columns. So there was probably a different composition. I doubt there was much overlap. A more detailed analysis might be able to shed light on that.
Well, once again, excellent. Thank you. I am going to end the Q&A and hand it over to our director, Tom Wormuth. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And thank you very much, Mark, Dr. Lander. That was an excellent lecture, which readies us for the 250th, the semi-quincentennial of the American Revolution. Remember, just 2 years away, 2025, is the 250th anniversary, the beginning of the American Revolution. This hasn't yet taken hold in the way the bicentennial did, but what's more important, a 200th anniversary or a 250th? And so it seemed to me a lot of attention.
Maybe I'll learn to pronounce semi-quincentennial by then.
That's bicentennial has such a nicer, more pleasant ring to it. So we probably do have to come up with another term, but until we do, semi-quincentennial is going to have to hold. Again, this was part of our American Revolution 250 series. I want to remind viewers, and so thank you for joining, remind viewers about subscribing to the Hudson River Valley Review. Subscriptions are available at hudsonrivervalley.org. This is, of course, the spring issue, which just came out. And now I want to hand this back over to Chris Prowess for a final word.
Okay, thank you. Once again, just to remind viewers that you will be receiving an email once we have this lecture available on our YouTube channel. That should be in the next several days. And please do stay tuned for additional programs in the series. And finally, we did place Dr. Lander's contact, which is on the slide, also in chat for anybody that wants to grab it there. Thanks again, and good night.
Right.